My parents, both of them, they were very smart. They said, look, everything that you'll see happening around us and to us, it has to do with your father's career, with his work.
He built one of the biggest privately owned placer mining operations in the Yukon without a business degree, a trust fund, or a plan B. He got fined $31,000 for setting a pond on fire on camera. He's been called the king of the Klondike, and depending on who you ask, his fortune sits anywhere between $15 million and $30 million. This is the story of Tony Beets, the Dutch farm boy who became the richest miner on television, and the price he paid to get there. Tony Beets was born on December 15, 1959, in Wijdeens, a small farming village in North Holland, Netherlands. His family made their living the way most families in that part of the country did: dairy farming, long hours, and weather that didn't care about anyone's plans. When Tony was around 7 years old, the Beets family relocated to Bergwoerd in the province of Friesland, a region known for its flat green farmland and centuries-old tradition of cattle raising. Life on a Dutch dairy farm in the 1960s and 70s wasn't glamorous. It meant early mornings, milking before school, and a household where every child was expected to contribute the moment they were old enough to carry a bucket. Tony has talked about this period as the foundation of who he became, not because the farm made him rich, but because it made him practical. He learned early how machines worked, how animals behaved, and how a single bad season could wipe out a year of effort. The defining moment of his childhood came when his father was seriously injured in a farm accident. With his dad unable to keep up the physical demands of the operation, teenage Tony found himself running day-to-day farm work and directing hired hands who were often decades older than he was. It's a kind of responsibility most 15-year-olds never have to think about, let alone shoulder. Tony has since described it as a turning point, the moment he stopped being a farm kid and started being the person other people looked to for direction. That instinct to take charge, even when he was the youngest person in the room, would follow him for the rest of his life. It was also in Wijdeens as children that Tony met Minnie, the girl who would become his wife, his business partner, and by most accounts the only person alive who can talk him out of a bad decision. They grew up as neighbors, became a couple in their early 20s, and married in December 1980. Weeks later, with reportedly around $300 between them and almost no English, they boarded a flight for a country neither of them had ever set foot in, Canada. Tony and Minnie's first stop in Canada wasn't anywhere near a gold mine. They settled near Salmon Arm, British Columbia, where Tony went back to the only trade he really knew, dairy farming, milking cows for wages on someone else's land. It was familiar work, but it wasn't the life he'd crossed an ocean for. From there, Tony pivoted into construction and pipeline work in Alberta, taking on whatever labor paid the bills, while he and Minnie tried to build a foothold in a country that owed them nothing. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that gold mining entered the picture. Tony made his way north to the Yukon and Dawson City, ground zero for the legendary Klondike Gold Rush of 1896, and took a job as a machine operator with a mining outfit. He had no formal background in placer mining. What he had was a lifetime of fixing farm equipment with whatever was lying around, and that turned out to translate almost perfectly to keeping aging bulldozers and wash plants alive through a brutal mining season. He spent a few years learning the trade from the ground up, operating heavy equipment, absorbing how the industry actually worked, and watching where other operators wasted money and time. By 1986, he'd saved and borrowed enough to strike out on his own, founding what would eventually become Tamarack Incorporated, the company that still anchors his empire today. It wasn't an overnight leap to riches. Placer mining in the Yukon is unforgiving. Permafrost that swallows machinery, spring floods that wash out a season's work in hours, and gold prices that can crater without warning. But Tony kept reinvesting whatever he made back into equipment and claims instead of cashing out, a habit that would define his entire career. Over the following decades, Tamarack Incorporated grew from a single leased claim into one of the largest privately held placer mining operations in the Yukon. Today, the company controls 337 placer mining claims across the Klondike region near Dawson City, the same gold-bearing ground that drew tens of thousands of prospectors north more than a century ago. Two of his most productive properties, Paradise Hill and Indian River, have become synonymous with the Beets name on television and in the industry. Tony's reputation was built less on luck and more on a willingness to gamble on equipment and ground that other miners considered too risky. The clearest example is his purchase of an old gold dredge, a massive, decades-old piece of machinery that hadn't run in years, for roughly $1 million. At the time, plenty of people in the industry thought he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Restoring a dredge that far north is an enormous undertaking, rusted steel, obsolete parts, and a machine that can just as easily bankrupt an operation as save it. Tony rebuilt it anyway. Once it was running, the dredge became one of the most efficient tools in his fleet, capable of processing enormous volumes of gravel with a fraction of the fuel and labor costs of his wash plants. It's now widely regarded as one of the only dredges of its kind still operating in North America, and it turned what critics called reckless into what the industry now calls visionary. That pattern, buy the equipment nobody else wants, fix what nobody else can, and put back to work, became the Tamarack playbook. Tony's fleet today includes multiple large excavators, bulldozers, wash plants, and that legendary dredge, representing millions of dollars in owned equipment. And that word, own, matters. Unlike a lot of operators in an industry known for leveraging debt against future gold, Tony has built a reputation for running his equipment outright, without loans hanging over the machines. In a business where a single bad season can be catastrophic, that's not a small detail. It's the entire reason his operation has survived nearly 4 decades of Yukon weather, market swings, and government regulation, while plenty of competitors have gone under. In a good season, Tamarack's operations have pulled between 1,500 and 2,000 ounces of gold, with some standout years reportedly reaching well beyond that. At current gold prices, a strong season alone can be worth millions in gross revenue before accounting for fuel, wages, repairs, and the punishing cost of simply keeping machinery alive through a Yukon winter. Tony Beets joined Discovery Channel's Gold Rush in its second season, initially in a supporting role, brought in as an experienced hand to advise newer, less seasoned miners on the show, including Todd Hoffman's crew. Nobody, including Tony himself, expected him to become one of the central figures of the franchise. But his blunt, no-nonsense personality, his fluency with heavy machinery, and his complete disinterest in performing for cameras made him an audience favorite almost immediately. By season 4, Tony had become a mentor figure to a young Parker Schnabel, and from there his screen time only grew. Over more than a decade on the show, he's appeared in well over 150 episodes, becoming arguably the most recognizable and most respected miner in the cast, a reputation built on the fact that, unlike some of his younger, flashier castmates, Tony's mining operation existed and was thriving long before Discovery ever showed up with a camera crew. His pay has grown along with his profile. While Discovery doesn't publish official salary figures, industry tracking outlets and entertainment reporting place his per-episode rate at roughly $25,000, which over a full season adds up to somewhere in the range of $300,000 to $500,000, money that comes on top of, not instead of, his actual mining income. It's a meaningful revenue stream, but by most accounts it's a fraction of what Tamarack Incorporated brings in during a strong gold season. Tony has never needed the show to be rich. It just made him famous. Not everything about Tony's television fame has worked in his favor. The most infamous moment of his run on Gold Rush came in October 2014, when a subcontractor working on his site poured roughly a gallon to a gallon and a half of gasoline into a dredge pond near Eureka Creek, close to the Indian River, and another crew member set it ablaze. The stunt, narrated on the show as a Viking baptism, aired on Discovery in February 2015, with Tony standing in front of the flames, arms outstretched, declaring, "I told you guys, come hell or high water, didn't I?" It made for dramatic television. It also violated Yukon's environmental laws. After the episode aired, mining enforcement officials received a complaint, and the incident became the basis of a formal prosecution under the Yukon Waters Act. In August 2017, a territorial court judge found Tony and Tamarack Incorporated guilty of permitting the deposit of waste into a water management area and failing to report it, with Tamarack also convicted on 2 additional counts tied to violations of its water license. The court fined Beets and his company a combined $31,000, well below the $50,000 plus the Crown had pushed for, but far above the roughly $14,000 his defense had proposed. The welder who actually poured the gasoline, Mark Favrin, pleaded guilty separately and was fined $1,725. The judge in the case, Peter Chisholm, didn't mince words, stating that Tony had been an active participant in the stunt and had the opportunity to stop it but didn't. Tony's own comments to the CBC afterward were characteristically direct. He acknowledged that as the man running the operation, he probably should have told his crew not to do it, and called the whole thing a joke gone bad. He and Tamarack Incorporated later appealed the fines through 2018, arguing they were excessive and that the court had improperly convicted the company multiple times for what was essentially a single act. But the core penalty stood. For a miner with an estimated net worth in the 8 figures, $31,000 barely registered financially. But it did real, if largely symbolic, damage to his image as a straight-shooting operator who plays by the rules everywhere except in front of a camera. It wasn't an isolated brush with regulators, either. Placer mining in the Yukon operates under some of the strictest water and land use rules in Canada, and an operation the size of Tamarack, dredging riverbeds, managing water licenses across hundreds of claims, and running heavy equipment through fragile permafrost terrain, is under near constant scrutiny from territorial regulators. Tony has been vocal on and off camera about his frustration with permitting delays and environmental compliance costs, arguing that regulation in the territory has become an obstacle to an industry that built the Yukon's economy in the first place. Environmental officials and conservation groups, for their part, point to real ecological stakes. Placer mining directly disturbs salmon-bearing waterways and river habitat, which is precisely why the Yukon Waters Act exists. So what is an estimated $15 to $20 million fortune? Some estimates run even higher. Actually look like for a man who spends 7 months of the year in a mining camp? Not, by most accounts, what people expect. During the mining season, Tony's living situation is famously modest. He and his crew work 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week, through mud, rain, and freezing temperatures, and by his own description, home for those months is a basic Yukon cabin, a couch to sleep on, and not much in the way of luxury. It's a detail that shows up again and again in profiles of him. The richest miner on the show still lives like a man on a work site during the season, because to him, that's exactly what it is. The wealth shows up elsewhere. Celebrity Net Worth and other financial trackers list Tony as owning a Mercedes convertible worth roughly $145,000, a striking contrast to the battered work trucks and decades-old excavators he's filmed operating on site. Multiple profiles